This story is a work of historical horror fiction. Although it uses 1878 Texas and the American Wild West as its backdrop, the events, characters, and deaths depicted here are fictionalized for storytelling purposes only. The saloon owner, the town of Dry Creek, and the fateful night of 12 deaths are not based on documented history, but rather on a dark reimagining of Western frontier life. It is not meant to promote violence, gambling, or superstition. Instead, it seeks to provide suspense, drama, and horror-inspired entertainment for mature audiences. The year was 1878, and the land of Texas was still trying to shake off the long scars of war, lawlessness, and survival. The cattle drives had turned dusty trails into arteries of fortune. Outlaws roamed freely, sometimes acting as hired guns, other times as parasites on the hardworking ranchers and traders. In this chaos, towns appeared like mushrooms after rain, each one growing around a railroad stop, a cattle pen, or most often, a saloon. One such place was Dry Creek, a settlement born on the edge of desolation. Dry Creek was no more than a stretch of dirt road lined with wooden buildings, a blacksmith's forge, a church with peeling white paint, a general store that sold everything from sugar to bullets, and at its heart, the largest saloon for miles around. This saloon, with its swinging doors and red lanterns glowing at dusk, was the beating heart of Dry Creek. Cowboys fresh off the cattle trail staggered inside for whiskey and cards. Prospectors tossed coins across its scarred wooden bar, buying drinks to drown their failures. Gunmen leaned against its posts, waiting for some fool to test their draw. And upstairs, the creak of bed springs told another story, one that kept the saloon running even when gold was scarce. But what made Dry Creek different from the other frontier towns was not its dust or its guns. It was its new owner, a man who came out of nowhere and seemed to carry with him the wealth of a banker and the composure of a preacher. His name was Jonas Cutter. Cutter's arrival was quiet but unforgettable. He came by stagecoach one hot summer morning, dressed in a black suit that looked far too fine for the Texas sun. His boots were polished, his hat perfectly angled, and his eyes, pale and unblinking, studied the town with a hunger few could name. Within days, he had purchased the saloon from its previous owner, a drunk who claimed Cutter's gold felt cold as river stones when he held it. No one asked where Jonas Cutter had come from, because in the Wild West, a man's past was less important than his ability to buy drinks for everyone in the room. From the beginning, Cutter's saloon thrived in a way that seemed unnatural. The shelves were always lined with whiskey bottles, though no supply wagon was ever seen unloading crates. The poker tables always attracted the wealthiest gamblers, who left the saloon either richer than kings or ruined beyond repair. Cutter himself rarely joined the games. Instead, he watched. He leaned against the upstairs balcony, his sharp eyes scanning the tables, his lips curling into a thin smile whenever someone's luck turned sour. The townsfolk of Dry Creek whispered that Cutter wasn't just a businessman. He had a way of knowing people before he met them. He would greet a cowboy by name, though they had never spoken. He would offer a drink to a man who hadn't yet asked for one. And he always seemed to know when someone was lying. On Sunday mornings, while the church bell rang, Cutter would stand on the saloon's porch, smoking a cigar, smiling faintly at the congregation walking past. To the preacher, he would tip his hat, and the preacher, though polite, always looked uneasy under that pale stare. Some said Jonas Cutter had come from New Orleans, fleeing debts or worse. Others swore he was once a Confederate officer who had made deals with the devil himself during the war. Whatever the truth, Cutter became the soul of Dry Creek's nights. Men and women alike were drawn to his saloon, unable to resist its warmth, its whiskey, and its promises of fortune. But beneath the laughter, the clinking glasses, and the piano music, there was something darker. The walls of the saloon seemed to breathe when no one was looking. Mirrors caught glimpses of faces that weren't there. And late at night, when only Cutter remained inside, the piano sometimes played by itself. A slow, haunting tune that echoed down the empty streets. The sheriff of Dry Creek, a stout man named Elias Grady, didn't like Cutter. He respected his money, but he didn't trust the man's stillness, the way he never seemed tired, never seemed to sweat, never seemed quite human. But law was thin in Dry Creek, and Cutter hadn't broken it. So the sheriff kept his suspicions quiet, nursing them over long nights of whiskey he bought, ironically, from Cutter's own bar. As autumn rolled into Texas, Dry Creek grew. More travelers stopped at the saloon. More gold changed hands across its tables. And more rumors spread, of people who went in and didn't come out. At first, it was blamed on drunken brawls or bandits on the road. But soon, the stories grew sharper. Men were last seen sitting at Cutter's tables. Women were last seen drinking from Cutter's glasses. And no one could say exactly where they went afterward. Still, the saloon thrived. Cutter thrived. Dry Creek itself seemed bound to the rhythm of the bar's swinging doors. Then came a night that would change the town forever. A night when 12 strangers would walk into Cutter's saloon, drawn by chance, by sin, or by fate. And by dawn, Dry Creek would be a town whispered about across the West, cursed, haunted, and scarred by 12 deaths in one night. That night had not yet come. But as Cutter lit his cigar on the balcony of his saloon, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen too much, it felt as though he had been waiting for it all along. The saloon of Dry Creek had become more than just a place of whiskey and cards. It was the town's pulsing heart, where fortunes were made, secrets were traded, and sins were whispered into the smoke-filled air. Yet, for all its brightness, there was a shadow at the core of it, a shadow tied to Jonas Cutter. From the moment he bought the place, his wealth seemed endless. Bottles of whiskey appeared as if by magic, crates stacked behind the bar though no freight wagon ever arrived. The piano never went out of tune, though no one saw a tuner visit. The lamps burned brighter and longer than those in any other building, though kerosene in Dry Creek was expensive and scarce. The more observant townsfolk began to mutter, "Where does Cutter get it all?" Cutter never gave answers. He just smiled. And in that smile, there was something both reassuring and terrifying, as though he knew more about a man's fate than the man himself. Whispers of a pact somewhere along the dusty streets of Dry Creek. A rumor took root. It spread among the cowhands, the gamblers, and the ladies upstairs. They said Jonas Cutter had made a bargain at midnight, not with men, but with something older, darker, and far hungrier. Old Hank, the blacksmith, swore he saw Cutter alone one night, behind the saloon, speaking in low tones to no one visible. He claimed Cutter held a silver flask in his hand, poured it out onto the ground, and the soil swallowed it like thirsty lips. Hank's son said he was lying, too much whiskey in his system. But Hank never set foot in the saloon again, muttering about shadows that drink. The town preacher, Reverend Cole, suspected it too. He often told his small congregation that evil had come to Dry Creek, cloaked in fine suits and polite words. He said the devil no longer wore horns. Instead, he wore boots, tipped his hat, and offered whiskey at a fair price. His sermons grew heated, his voice trembling with a fear he never named aloud. But the people laughed. Cutter's saloon kept the town alive, and no one wanted to turn away the gold it brought. Still, the unease deepened when stories from travelers reached Dry Creek. A prospector passing through swore Cutter had been seen years earlier in New Orleans, running a gambling hall where the odds always bent against the player. Another insisted he had glimpsed Cutter in Kansas, 15 years prior, looking exactly the same, not aged a single day. Cutter denied both stories with a laugh, but his pale eyes didn't blink when he did. Cutter's office behind the bar and past the narrow hallway leading upstairs was a door few dared to open, Cutter's private office. No one knew what was inside, for Cutter never invited guests, not even his most loyal workers. The bartender, a thin man named Lester Pike, admitted once that he'd heard strange noises at night coming from behind that door. Whispers that rose and fell like prayers, followed by a silence so heavy it made the hairs on his arms stand up. Others claimed to hear screams muffled by the walls, though when Cutter opened the saloon the next morning, there was never a trace of blood or violence. Only a fresh shipment of whiskey stacked neatly on the shelves, as if it had appeared out of thin air. The bravest or most foolish tried to peek through the keyhole once. He was a gambler named Jeb Rollins, drunk on bourbon and bravado. He pressed his eye to the lock late one night and staggered back, white as a ghost. When asked what he saw, he stammered only one phrase before leaving town forever. There were more eyes staring back at me than a man should ever see. The bargain revealed, though none in Dry Creek could prove it. Cutter's midnight bargain was real. Long before he came to Texas, he had stood at a crossroads. Not the kind where dirt trails meet, but one far darker, a place between the living and the damned. There, in exchange for his soul, or perhaps something far more valuable, he was promised wealth, charm, and power over men's desires. But the bargain demanded payment. Not in gold, not in land, but in lives. Every death inside Cutter's walls fed the bargain, strengthening the bond between him and the force that whispered through his whiskey bottles and haunted his mirrors. Every soul lost in the saloon became fuel for his endless supply of liquor, his ageless face, and his unnatural fortune. The reason the saloon never ran dry, the reason the lamps never dimmed, the reason Cutter seemed untouchable, was because he wasn't working alone. The waiting. By the time autumn winds began to sweep across Texas, Cutter had been waiting. He could feel it in the way the saloon's walls vibrated at night, in the way the piano keys pressed themselves down when no hand touched them. Something was coming, a night when his bargain would demand more than a life here or there. And Jonas Cutter was ready. He polished his boots, cleaned his pistols, and ordered fresh whiskey glasses, as though expecting company. His bartender asked him once, nervously, why he seemed so prepared. Cutter only smiled and said, "Because midnight has a way of bringing together all the souls that belong in one place." Lester didn't ask again. The town looks on meanwhile. The townsfolk continued to drink, gamble, and laugh within Cutter's walls. They ignored the unease that prickled their skin when Cutter's eyes swept across the room. They explained away the sudden disappearances. A cowboy run off with a woman, a drifter caught by bandits on the trail, a miner too deep in debt to stay. But not everyone was blind. Sheriff Grady noticed how every missing man's last night had been spent in Cutter's saloon. He tried to ask questions, but no one wanted to answer. Fear had gripped the town like an iron shackle, and Cutter's shadow was longer than the sheriff's badge. Even the preacher grew quiet. His fire and brimstone warnings faded, his sermons shrinking to whispers, as though he realized speaking Cutter's name too often might summon something listening in the dark, foreshadowing the night. And then it happened. On a stormy night in October, lightning cracking across the desert sky, a stagecoach rattled into Dry Creek carrying a band of strangers. 12 in all: gamblers, gunmen, a drifter, a prospector, a woman with sharp eyes, and even a preacher passing through. They arrived like moths to a flame, stepping out into the rain, their boots splashing in the mud as the saloon doors swung wide to welcome them. Jonas Cutter stood at the bar, already waiting, his pale eyes glinting in the lamplight. He smiled the same thin smile he had worn since the day he first arrived in Dry Creek. "Welcome, friends," he said softly. "The night is long, and the whiskey's on me." And though none of them knew it yet, they had just stepped into the bargain snare. A snare woven in whispers, sealed in blood, and waiting to be paid in full. The night was stormy, the kind of storm that rattled shutters and rolled thunder across the endless Texas sky. Dry Creek had seen its share of bad weather, but this one seemed different. The clouds gathered thick and black as if the heavens themselves were watching. Lightning lit up the horizon in jagged strokes, carving strange shapes into the night. It was on this very night that 12 strangers arrived, each from a different corner of the frontier, each carrying secrets that clung to them like dust on their boots. Fate, or something far more deliberate, had drawn them together, and their paths all converged on Jonas Cutter's saloon. The first to arrive was Caleb Briggs, a gunslinger of about 30, tall and lean with eyes as sharp as the Colt revolvers at his hip. He had a reputation that traveled ahead of him, a man who never lost a duel, though some whispered his victories came less from skill and more from cruelty. Caleb swaggered through the swinging doors, dripping rainwater, his boots echoing on the floorboards as Cutter greeted him with a nod. The second was Martha Ellison, a woman in her late 30s dressed in a faded traveling dress. She carried herself with dignity, though her eyes betrayed a weariness too deep for her years. Unknown to the others, she had once been the wife of a wealthy cattle baron back east, but scandal had driven her west. Her secrets weighed heavy. Secrets Cutter already seemed to know as he offered her the finest seat by the fire. Then came Jedediah Cross, a preacher in his 40s, traveling with nothing but a weathered Bible and a pistol tucked into his belt. His voice was stern, his jaw set hard. He claimed to be passing through on his way to Galveston, but the truth was he had been running from sins not even Scripture could erase. The storm carried in more. A prospector named Harvey Kincaid, his beard matted with dirt, gold dust still clinging to his fingernails. His luck in the hills had turned bad, and he was desperate for redemption. A drifter called Eli Turner, only 20, walked in next. His eyes were wild, his hands trembling, and a scar ran down his cheek. He claimed to be looking for work, but his haunted gaze told another story. He was fleeing something or someone. Two brothers entered together, Frank and Daniel Harlan, gamblers by trade, with matching smirks and a deck of cards worn from use. They had cheated their way across the frontier, but this night, the cards would not deal in their favor. A tall Mexican vaquero, Miguel Alvarez, soaked from the rain, stepped in quietly. He said little, but the pistol at his side and the hardness in his eyes told of battles fought and lost. Then came Sarah Pike, younger sister of Cutter's bartender, Lester. She had returned to town after years away, with sharp wit and sharper suspicions. She was the only one who looked at Cutter not with awe, but with wariness. Another stranger, Thomas Grady, walked in. He was the sheriff's cousin, though the two men barely spoke. Thomas was a bounty hunter, known for bringing men back alive, though often half-dead. Two more rounded out the dozen. Silas Crow, a gambler with a silver tongue and a hollow soul, and Clara Reed, a saloon singer who had drifted west after burning too many bridges in New Orleans. 12 in all. 12 souls. Cutter's welcome Jonas Cutter stood at the bar, perfectly calm, as though he had expected every last one of them. His pale eyes flickered over their faces, and for each, he had a drink waiting. To new company, he said smoothly, raising a glass. May the night be long, and may fortune favor the bold. The storm howled outside, but inside the saloon the lamps burned steady, the whiskey flowed, and the piano began to play, though no one had touched its keys. The newcomers laughed nervously, assuming it was a trick of the storm. Cutter only smiled. Hidden sins the 12 strangers might have appeared ordinary. Cowboys, gamblers, wanderers, but each carried a sin they thought buried. Caleb Briggs, the gunslinger, had killed not for survival, but for pleasure. Martha Ellison had poisoned her wealthy husband before fleeing west. Preacher Cross had broken his vows, leaving a woman and child abandoned in Kansas. Harvey Kincaid had murdered a partner in the hills to claim a vein of gold for himself. Eli Turner had betrayed his own gang, leading them into an ambush to save his own life. The Harlan brothers had bled towns dry with their card-sharp tricks, leaving bodies in their wake. Miguel Alvarez carried the shame of a desertion during the war in Mexico. Sarah Pike had betrayed a family friend for money and never confessed. Thomas Grady, the bounty hunter, had once killed an innocent man to claim a bounty. Silas Crow had stolen fortunes through lies, leading others to ruin. Clara Reed had left behind a trail of death. Men who loved her, men she discarded. These sins were hidden from one another, but not from Cutter. He seemed to see each one, as though their souls were written plainly across their faces. The trap closes as the night deepened. The strangers grew comfortable. They drank, gambled, laughed, and argued. Thunder rolled, but no one dared leave. The rain was too heavy, the mud too thick, and besides, the saloon felt warm, alive, welcoming. Yet beneath it all was an unease. The doors never seemed to open once closed. The windows fogged over, though no one touched them, and the air carried a charge, like the waiting silence before lightning splits the sky. Jonas Cutter walked among them, quiet and watchful. His presence was magnetic, pulling them closer into the heart of the saloon. When he finally suggested a game of cards, a game where the stakes would be higher than gold, none of them refused. It was as though they couldn't. The strangers didn't know it, but they had not stumbled into Cutter's saloon by accident. They had been summoned, drawn together by the weight of their sins, gathered under one roof for a night that would end in blood. And as midnight neared, the storm outside roared louder, shaking the windows, rattling the walls, like some vast force pressing in from the dark. Cutter poured himself a glass, raised it to his lips, and whispered so softly no one else could hear, "They've all come, at last." The saloon of Dry Creek had never felt so alive. The storm outside pounded the roof with relentless rain, thunder shaking the walls, but inside the whiskey flowed as though the barrels had no end. The 12 strangers sat scattered across the poker tables, their boots propped on chairs, their hands clutching cards, their pockets heavy with coin. Cutter's piano hummed softly in the background, though no man played. Jonas Cutter moved between them like a conductor guiding an orchestra. His pale eyes lingered on every face, every nervous laugh, every desperate sip of whiskey. He had spent weeks preparing for this night, and now the stage was set. Cutter's proposal by midnight, when the lamps burned low and shadows clung to the corners of the room, Cutter called for silence. He raised a glass of whiskey and tapped it against the poker table, drawing all 12 sets of eyes toward him. "Friends," he began, his voice calm, smooth, heavy with confidence. "You've traveled far. Each of you carries a burden, a secret, a sin. You drink to forget, you gamble to feel alive, you fight to escape. But tonight I offer you something greater than coin or cards. Tonight I offer you a chance at redemption or ruin." The gamblers smirked, the gunslinger leaned forward with interest, and even the preacher narrowed his eyes, uncertain whether to rebuke or listen. Cutter spread a fresh deck of cards on the table. "One game," he said, "for stakes beyond gold. Win and fortune favors you forever. Lose and—" he smiled thinly. "Well, you'll see." No one moved at first. Then Caleb Briggs, the gunslinger, slammed his palm against the table. "Deal the cards," he growled. The others followed, some eager, some fearful, but none able to resist. The first hands Cutter dealt smoothly, the cards whispering across the table like dry leaves. The game began simple, with gold and silver coins tossed into the center. Yet the longer they played, the more the stakes shifted. First it was money, then jewelry, a silver locket, a gold pocket watch, a wedding ring. Then possessions. Rifles, boots, even a horse claimed outside in the mud. But Cutter leaned in, his voice low, hypnotic. "Surely your souls are worth more than trinkets." The room grew colder. No one laughed. Still, they played on. The shadows stir as the game deepened. Strange things began to happen. The lamp flames flickered, though there was no draft. The shadows stretched longer than they should, crawling across the floor like living things. Martha Ellison, the widow, swore she saw her dead husband's face staring back at her from the whiskey glass. Eli Turner, the young drifter, dropped his cards when he noticed the mirror behind Cutter reflecting not 12 players, but 13. Yet Cutter's voice kept them bound. "One more hand," he said, over and over, each time with a smile that made it impossible to refuse. The preacher gripped his Bible tightly, whispering prayers under his breath, but his hands trembled as he played on. His lips formed words of scripture, but his eyes betrayed his fear. He knew something unholy had taken hold. The first death, it came suddenly. Silas Crow, the silver-tongued gambler, slapped down his hand with a grin, 4 kings. But Cutter's hand spread across the table showed 4 aces, each card's ink glowing faintly red. Silas's grin faltered. His skin went pale. Then, without a sound, his body seized. His glass toppled, whiskey spilling across the table. As his eyes rolled back in his head, he fell to the floor, twitching once before going still. The room erupted. Chairs scraped back. Shouts filled the air. But Cutter only raised a hand. "The game claims its due," he said softly. "Sit down. The night is not over." No one wanted to obey, yet they did. It was as if unseen chains dragged them back into their chairs. Even the sheriff's cousin, hardened bounty hunter Thomas Grady, could not move against the pull of Cutter's voice. 1 death, 11 left. Panic and denial. Harvey Kincaid, the prospector, stammered. He drank too much, that's all. Nothing more. But when they looked at Silas's body, his lips were blackened, his veins dark as if poisoned from within. No whiskey could do that. Martha clutched her chest. The Harlan brothers exchanged nervous glances. Eli Turner muttered about leaving, but when he staggered to the door, he found it sealed tight, as though the storm itself pressed against it. He pulled, he kicked, but the wood held. No one leaves, Cutter said gently, until the hand is finished. The descent. The game resumed, though now every card felt heavy, every coin clinking like a death knell. The players grew pale, sweating, whispering curses under their breath. One by one, the cards turned against them. Clara Reed, the saloon singer, began to laugh uncontrollably before coughing blood across the table. She collapsed, her hand slipping from the cards. Another gone. The Harlan brothers fought over a hand, each accusing the other of cheating. Their quarrel turned to violence. A pistol drawn, a shot fired. Daniel fell dead, his brother's hand shaking with the smoking gun. Cutter leaned back, smiling faintly, as though every drop of blood fed his bargain. The preacher slammed his Bible onto the table. "This is the devil's work," he cried. "You'll damn us all, Cutter." But Cutter only replied, "You damned yourselves long before tonight." Midnight approaches. By now, the room was stifling, though the storm still roared outside. Shadows pressed close, circling the survivors like vultures waiting to feast. The piano's keys moved on their own, playing a slow funeral dirge. 6 remained, their faces etched with terror. They no longer played for gold. They played because they could not stop. The cards seemed to deal themselves, binding their hands, their fates sealed by every shuffle. Every death had been foretold. Cutter knew it, though the others still clung to denial. His bargain demanded 12 souls, and by dawn he would have them. He lifted his glass, savoring the whiskey as though it were blood. "Play on," he whispered. And they did, because they had no choice. The saloon had become a tomb. The rain hammered the windows like fists, the thunder split the sky wide, and the air inside grew thick with the stink of sweat, whiskey, and death. 3 bodies already lay sprawled across the floor. Silas Crow with his blackened lips, Clara Reed with blood still glistening on the poker table, and Daniel Harlan, shot dead by his own brother. The survivors sat rigid around the card table, their eyes darting toward Cutter, who poured himself another drink as calmly as if nothing had happened. Every plank in the floor creaked under the weight of fear. The growing tension. Frank Harlan, hands trembling, still held his revolver. His eyes were wild, darting from the dead body of his brother to Cutter's face. You made me do it," he hissed. "This ain't no game. This is a slaughterhouse." Cutter smiled faintly, lifting his glass. "No, Mr. Harlan. You pulled the trigger. The cards only revealed what you already carried inside." The others shifted uneasily. Eli Turner's breathing came fast and shallow. Martha Ellison wrung her hands, whispering prayers half-remembered from her childhood. The preacher, Jedediah Cross, kept his Bible open on the table, though his hand rested just as firmly on the pistol at his belt. Miguel Alvarez muttered something in Spanish, his voice low and grim. Harvey Kincaid, the prospector, clutched his sack of gold dust like a talisman, as though the shimmer of fortune could shield him from whatever curse held the room. The saloon transforms. As the game pressed on, the saloon itself seemed to change. The walls groaned as if the wood had grown old in an instant. The lamps flickered, their flames shrinking to eerie pinpricks of blue. A draft swept through the room, though every window was sealed shut. And the floorboards, they began to darken. At first, it looked like spilled whiskey soaking into the wood. But the stain spread, thick and sticky, smelling of copper. Blood seeped upward through the cracks, tracing rivers between the boards, pooling beneath the chairs. Sarah Pike gasped and pushed her chair back, but the legs stuck fast, glued to the floor by the rising blood. She looked at Cutter with wide eyes. "What in God's name have you done?" Cutter set down his drink, his voice calm as a preacher's sermon. "This place has always been thirsty. I merely gave it what it craved." Another death. The cards slid across the table again, though no one touched the deck. They moved as if guided by invisible hands. Harvey Kincaid stared at his hand, his eyes narrowing, sweat dripping down his face. He slammed the cards down. 3 queens. "There. I win. I ain't going down like the rest of 'em." But Cutter's hand spread slowly across the table. 3 kings. Higher. Always higher. Harvey let out a strangled cry. He clawed at his chest, his fingernails breaking the skin as if something inside him was trying to claw its way out. His eyes bulged, his mouth opened in a silent scream, and then, with a sickening crack, he collapsed onto the table. Blood poured from his mouth, running across the cards, mingling with the stains already on the floorboards. 5 dead. 7 remained. The breaking point. The survivors were no longer pretending this was chance. They knew now. Every hand dealt was another nail in their coffins. Yet still they played. Cutter's power was not simply in the cards, but in the hold he had over them. Their hands shook, but they could not drop their cards. Their hearts pounded, but they could not walk away. They were bound, puppets dancing to the strings of his voice, their sins dragging them down like lead weights. The preacher stood suddenly, slamming his Bible closed. "No more. I'll not sit at the devil's table." He pointed his pistol at Cutter, his voice cracking with fury. "I'll end this now." The others froze. Sarah gasped. Martha clutched her dress, and Frank Harlan whispered, "Shoot him! Just shoot!" Cutter didn't flinch. He looked the preacher in the eyes, his smile never wavering. "Do it, then. Pull the trigger. See what salvation your bullets bring." Cross pulled the trigger. The shot cracked like lightning. Smoke filled the air. But when it cleared, Cutter was still standing, untouched, the bullet lodged in the far wall. The preacher staggered back, terror etched across his face. His pistol clattered to the floor. "Lord, forgive me." The floorboards groaned, and blood surged upward in a sudden flood, wrapping around his boots, dragging him down. The others screamed as the preacher sank chest deep into the floor, his arms flailing, his Bible lost to the rising tide. His scream cut short as the blood swallowed him whole. 6 dead. 6 remained. The unraveling. The survivors were breaking now. Martha sobbed openly, rocking in her chair. Eli Turner's eyes darted wildly, sweat streaking his face. Miguel Alvarez whispered a prayer in Spanish, gripping his rosary until his knuckles turned white. Sarah Pike, however, stared Cutter down. She had not touched her cards in several hands, but the game still forced them into her grip. Her voice trembled with rage. "You're not a man at all. You're something else. Something that crawled out of hell wearing a man's skin." Cutter tilted his head, considering her words, then smiled. "Perhaps, or perhaps I am only what men make of me. The hunger they feed, the darkness they invite." He raised his glass once more. "Play on." And the cards slid across the table again, blood dripping from their edges like ink. Midnight's toll. The clock above the bar chimed 12 times. Each chime rang heavy, echoing louder than the storm. With every strike, the lamps flickered, the walls shook, and the blood on the floor bubbled like boiling water. By the 12th chime, the saloon was no longer a place of wood and glass, but something darker. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows writhed like living things, and the floor was a sea of crimson. The 7 survivors clutched their cards, unable to let go, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They were not gamblers anymore. They were prey. And Jonas Cutter, standing tall at the center of it all, looked as though the storm itself bowed to him. His smile widened, and his voice rolled over them like a command carved into stone. "Half have fallen, half remain. The balance will be restored before dawn." By now, the Crimson Dove Saloon no longer resembled anything human-built. The lamps burned dim and unnatural. The shadows writhed across the walls, and the floor had become a living pool of blood, sticky and restless, rising and falling like the breath of some buried beast. 6 survivors sat trapped at the card table. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling, their eyes hollow from fear and sleepless dread. No one dared to speak above a whisper anymore except Cutter. Jonas Cutter looked calm, almost joyous. He shuffled the blood-stained deck as if he were cradling Holy Scripture. "The night is nearly over," he said, his voice carrying over the storm outside. "But the game must finish what it started. Half the circle is broken. Half still waits." The survivors, Frank Harlan, trembling with guilt, stared at the blood-soaked body of his brother. His revolver still smoked in his mind, though the bullet had been fired long ago. His lips trembled with words he could not form. Sarah Pike, sharp-eyed and furious, leaned forward, her jaw set. Of all of them, she alone refused to crumble. Her defiance burned, though fear gnawed at the edges. Martha Ellison, the widow, clutched the hem of her dress, mumbling broken prayers through sobs, her faith as fragile as her shaking hands. Eli Turner, young and wild-eyed, tapped his fingers against the table like a man on the verge of madness. He was desperate to run, though his boots were glued by blood to the boards. Miguel Alvarez, clutching his rosary, whispered in Spanish, sweat dripping from his temples. His prayer was steady, but his voice trembled with every word. Thomas Grady, the bounty hunter, sat stiff-backed, his eyes locked on Cutter with hate. He had not spoken since the preacher's death, but his hand rested near his holstered gun, though he must have known bullets meant nothing. Cutter raises the stakes. Cutter spread the cards before them, his pale fingers slick with crimson. "The stakes have shifted," he said softly. "Gold is gone, trinkets are worthless. Now every hand costs blood, yours or another's." The survivors exchanged horrified looks. Sarah Pike spat into the pool of blood on the floor. "You'll get nothing from me." Cutter's smile deepened. "Ah, but the house always wins." The deck moved without his touch, cards sliding into place before each player. Their hands lifted unwillingly, as though invisible strings forced their fingers open. The widow falls. Martha Ellison's sobs grew louder as she stared at her cards. I can't do this anymore," she whimpered. Her shoulders shook violently. She dropped her hand to the table. "Fold," Cutter whispered. The moment the word left his lips, the blood on the floor surged upward like a wave. It wrapped around Martha's legs, pulling her down. She screamed, clawing at the table, her fingernails leaving bloody grooves in the wood. Sarah and Eli tried to grab her arms, but their hands slid uselessly against her skin. With a final shriek, Martha vanished beneath the floor, the blood swallowing her whole. Only a ripple remained. 5 survivors. Eli's desperation. Eli Turner's breathing grew ragged, his body shaking like a man fevered. He slammed his cards onto the table, shouting, "To hell with this. I'm not playing. You hear me? I'm done." He stood, ripping himself from the chair with such force that blood spattered across his chest. He bolted toward the door, boots thudding against the soaked wood. But the door didn't open. It melted. The handle sagged like wax, the boards bleeding, sealing the exit as if the saloon itself had become flesh. Eli pounded with both fists, screaming curses, begging God, clawing until his nails tore off. Then he turned, eyes wide with madness, as Cutter's voice slid across the room like smoke. "You can leave the table only when the house allows." The floor opened beneath Eli like a mouth. His scream echoed as he dropped into endless darkness, swallowed by the saloon itself. For survivors, the bounty hunter strikes the bounty hunter. Thomas Grady had seen enough. He stood slowly, his hand moving with steady purpose to his revolver. His voice was cold, controlled, each word heavy as stone. "I've hunted killers across 3 states. I've put men in the ground for less than half of what you've done tonight. I don't care what you are, Cutter. You bleed, and if you bleed, you can die." With a flick of his wrist, he drew and fired. 1 shot, 2, 3, each bullet striking Cutter square in the chest. The sound of gunfire thundered through the saloon. Cutter staggered back, crimson soaking his vest. For a heartbeat, hope flickered in the survivor's eyes. Then Cutter laughed. He straightened, the bullets falling from his chest like stones. The wounds closed instantly, leaving not even a scar. "You misunderstand, Mr. Grady," he said gently. "Death is not a burden I share with men." The blood surged up the legs of the bounty hunter's chair, wrapping around his waist like chains. He fired again and again, screaming curses, but the blood pulled him down, dragging him beneath the floorboards as easily as a stone sinks in water. His gun clattered to the table as his voice was swallowed by the crimson sea. 3 survivors. Frank Harlan was shaking so violently he nearly dropped his cards. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked at Cutter with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Please," he begged. "I didn't mean to kill Daniel. You made me do it. It wasn't me. It wasn't." Cutter leaned forward, his pale eyes glowing faintly. "You pulled the trigger. You chose his death. Don't blame the dealer for the hand you played." Frank fell to his knees, sobbing, clutching at Cutter's coat like a child begging his father. "I'll do anything. Please, don't let me die here." Cutter touched his face almost tenderly. Then he whispered, "You already have." Frank's body convulsed violently, his screams filling the saloon. His skin blistered and split as if fire burned from within. In moments, he collapsed into a smoking husk, blood seeping from his mouth and eyes. 2 survivors. The final 2, Sarah Pike and Miguel Alvarez, sat across from Cutter now, the last of 12. Their cards lay on the table, slick with blood, their breaths ragged. Their eyes locked not on the game but on each other. Sarah's defiance still burned, though her face was pale, her lips trembling. Miguel's prayer continued under his breath, though even his faith seemed to falter as the saloon closed in around them. Cutter leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. His smile widened, calm and certain. "2 hands remain," he said softly. "The night draws near its end. But before the dawn, the game must claim what it was promised." He gestured to the deck, the cards waiting, pulsing faintly with a glow like hot embers. "Play," Cutter commanded, and the last 2 players raised their hands, their fates sealed in the crimson light of the saloon. The storm outside had begun to die, the thunder rolling farther into the horizon. But inside the Crimson Dove Saloon, time itself seemed to twist and stretch. The air was thick with the iron tang of blood, and the shadows along the walls swayed like figures watching from the corners. Only 2 survivors remained at the table now. Sarah Pike, the woman with fire still burning in her eyes, and Miguel Alvarez, whose whispered prayers clung to the edges of faith like a drowning man clutching driftwood. And across from them sat Jonas Cutter, untouched, unshaken, his pale smile carved as if into stone. The final hand begins. The cards moved without touch, sliding across the table in a slow, deliberate circle. They dripped with blood, each one heavier than paper should be. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted hers, though her glare never left Cutter's face. Miguel held his with shaking fingers, his rosary clinking softly as his lips whispered Ave Maria. Cutter folded his hands beneath his chin, his voice calm as the dawn. 2 remain. 1 will walk into the daylight. The other will stay with me. Sarah spat onto the floor, her voice sharp. "I don't care what you are, Cutter. You won't have me." Miguel's prayer grew louder, more desperate, his eyes burning with both faith and fear. Cutter's smile deepened. "Then let us see what fate decrees." The cards speak. Sarah spread her hand on the table. Pair of aces. Strong. She lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. Miguel, with trembling hands, revealed his, a flush, red and perfect. Stronger. His eyes widened, his lips parting in something close to hope. Sarah's jaw tightened, her fists clenched. "So what? It's just paper. Just cards." Cutter leaned forward, his gaze settling on her. "Not just cards, Miss Pike. Judgment." The floor groaned. The blood bubbled. The shadows reached like claws toward Sarah's boots. Sarah's defiance, the saloon seemed ready to claim her. But Sarah stood, her chair screeching back against the wet floorboards. She slammed her fists onto the table, her voice cracking with fury. "No, you don't get to decide. You don't get to take me like you took the others." She grabbed the lamp from the table and hurled it against the wall. Flames burst across the blood-soaked boards, the fire licking upward with a hiss and roar. Smoke filled the air. The survivors coughed, their eyes watering. But Cutter only laughed. The fire bent, twisting in unnatural shapes, curling towards Sarah like fingers of light. The flames did not spread as fire should. Instead, they gathered, circling her. Sarah screamed but did not beg. She fought, clawing, kicking, her curses swallowed by fire. The flames rose higher, wrapping her body in a crown of light. For one terrible moment, her outline glowed bright and fierce, and then collapsed into ash. Her scream echoed long after she was gone. Miguel Alvarez fell to his knees, clutching his rosary, his tears falling into the blood at his feet. Miguel alone, only Miguel remained. His lips quivered with his prayer, but now it was no longer steady. It was frantic, desperate, shouted into the storm of hell that surrounded him. Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros pecadores. Ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte. The rosary shook in his hands. His voice cracked. His heart pounded so loud it seemed to echo off the walls. Cutter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was soft, almost tender. "Your faith burns bright, Miguel. But faith has never kept a man from the grave." Miguel raised his rosary high. His eyes locked on Cutter's, and for the first time that night, his voice rang clear and strong. "You may take my flesh, but you will never take my soul." The dawn breaks at that exact moment. A crack split the horizon outside. The storm broke. A thin line of gold light pierced through the eastern windows, cutting across the table, slicing through shadow. Cutter's smile faltered, just for an instant. His skin rippled, his face twisting, as though the sunlight scorched him. He hissed and recoiled, shadows wrapping around him like a cloak. Miguel's prayer grew louder, filling the room, rising with the light. The rosary glowed faintly in his grip, the silver cross reflecting the dawn. Cutter rose to his feet, his eyes burning, his voice a thunderclap. "The game is not done." But the sun rose higher, its light spilling across the saloon. The shadows writhed, shrieking as they burned away. The blood on the floor steamed, evaporating into black smoke. Cutter let out a howl, not of rage, but of anguish, like an ancient thing torn from the earth itself. His body twisted, stretched, then shattered into 1,000 shards of shadow that scattered into nothing. Silence and then silence. The saloon stood empty, ruined. Blood stains remained, burned into the boards, but the living sea was gone. The air smelled of smoke and iron, the dawn light spilling gently across overturned chairs and broken glass. Miguel Alvarez knelt in the center of it all, clutching his rosary. His lips moved soundlessly now, no more prayers, only breath. He was the last. The reckoning as the sun rose higher. Miguel stood slowly, unsteady on his feet. He looked around at the bodies, or what remained of them. Ash where Sarah had stood, a husk where Frank had fallen. No trace at all of those the saloon had swallowed whole. Only 12 glasses sat on the bar, each still half filled with whiskey. Miguel's hands shook as he picked one up. The amber liquid trembled in the glass, catching the sunlight. He whispered, barely audible, "Dios me salvo?" But at what cost? And as he drank, his reflection in the glass shimmered strangely. His eyes flickering, just for an instant, with Cutter's pale light. The sun rose over the Texas plains, its light washing away the last shadows of the storm. But though the sky was bright, the Crimson Dove Saloon stood like a scar on the land. Its roof sagged, its windows shattered, its door half-hinged, dripping with soot and dried blood. Inside, Miguel Alvarez staggered through the wreckage. He had survived, but not untouched. The rosary dangled from his fingers, yet his hands shook with more than exhaustion. Something inside him had shifted, some tether pulled too tight and now fraying. The saloon was empty, but Miguel swore he heard faint whispers in the corners, echoes of laughter and screams lingering like smoke. The walk into town hours later, he stumbled into the streets of Garrison Creek, the nearest town. His boots dragged, his clothes torn, his face pale as bone. Townsfolk gathered quickly, their whispers rising. "That's Miguel Alvarez. Wasn't he with the Harlan boys last night? Where's Frank? Where's Sarah? Dear Lord. He looks like he's seen the devil himself." Miguel collapsed in the dirt, clutching his rosary to his chest. The sheriff knelt beside him, demanding answers. But Miguel could only whisper one thing, over and over. "Cutter!" Cutter dealt the cards. The sheriffs returned the sheriff, and a group of armed men rode out to the saloon that evening, following Miguel's broken directions. They expected bandits, maybe a shootout. But when they arrived, they found nothing but ruin. The saloon stood cold and lifeless, its interior blackened by fire, its floors crusted with old blood. No bodies remained, no sign of Cutter. Only the smell of whiskey and smoke clung to the air. On the card table they found a single playing card, the ace of spades, burned black around the edges. The sheriff returned pale, refusing to speak of what he'd seen inside. Miguel's burden in the weeks that followed. Miguel tried to resume his life. He worked the cattle herds, prayed daily at the small mission, and tried to bury the memory. But every night his dreams betrayed him. He dreamt of the saloon, the whispers, the screams, the rising blood. And always, at the end, he saw Jonas Cutter's pale smile across the table. Worse still, sometimes when Miguel looked in the mirror, his reflection wavered. His own eyes flickered pale, like Cutter's had been. He prayed harder, but the whispers followed him. The first death after it wasn't long before death followed Miguel. One night, in the mission's boarding house, a young man sharing his bunk room woke screaming. By morning, he was dead. His face pale, his lips blackened, as if he had drowned in blood though his lungs were dry. The townsfolk whispered that Miguel brought the curse with him, that he had bargained with the devil in that saloon. The priest tried to defend him, but more deaths followed. A girl in the marketplace collapsed, her eyes rolling white. A ranch hand was found lifeless in the field, a single playing card clutched in his hand. Each death brought whispers of the same thing. A game unfinished. Miguel confronts the truth, haunted and desperate. Miguel returned to the ruins of the Crimson Dove one moonless night. His rosary glowed faintly in the dark, his prayers tumbling from his lips in a fevered rush. He dropped to his knees at the card table's remains. "What do you want from me?" he cried. "Why won't you let me go?" The air grew heavy, the shadows deepened, and from the far corner of the saloon, a voice answered, smooth, calm, and terrible. "You walked away, Miguel. But no game ends until all debts are paid." Jonas Cutter stepped from the shadows, untouched by fire or time. His pale smile gleamed in the darkness. Miguel clutched his rosary tighter, his voice cracking. "I beat you." The dawn came. "You were gone." Cutter leaned close, his breath cold as winter. "The dawn freed you, yes, but not from me. You carry the table now. You are the dealer." Miguel froze. The rosary slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the boards. His breath caught in his throat as realization dawned. The curse had not been broken. It had been passed. The new dealer from that night forward, the Crimson Dove, was no longer a place. It was Miguel himself. Wherever he went, death followed. Cards appeared in the hands of strangers. Dice rolled on their own. One by one, the circle grew, and Miguel could do nothing but watch as the game claimed new souls. He prayed, he wept, he begged for release. But Cutter's laughter echoed always in his ears. The legend grows by the turn of the century. The tale of the Crimson Dove Saloon had spread far across Texas and beyond. Cowboys told it by campfire, whispering of the night 12 souls vanished into blood. Gamblers refused to play with a man who carried a rosary, for fear he was the cursed survivor. And some swore that if you played cards after midnight in a deserted saloon, The shadows would lengthen, the lamps would flicker, and a pale dealer with a strange smile would sit across from you. Some swore he looked like Jonas Cutter. Others swore he looked like Miguel Alvarez. Epilogue: the card in the dust in 1912. Long after Miguel had vanished from record, a prospector stumbled upon the ruins of the Crimson Dove. The building had collapsed to ash, little more than a blackened frame. He found nothing but dust and glass, until he reached the center of the floor. There, lying half-buried in the dirt, was a single playing card, the ace of spades, and when he lifted it, the prospector swore he heard faint laughter echoing in the wind. Closing note: the Crimson Dove Saloon burned, rebuilt, and burned again. It became nothing more than a ghost story, a legend passed from cowboy to outlaw to drifter. But the curse of Jonas Cutter never ended. It only changed hands. And somewhere, on some midnight table, the game still goes on. Because in the Wild West, whiskey wasn't the only thing the saloon served. It served death, one hand at a time. It too.